Hi everyone, welcome to a special GZERO Media live stream from COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. I'm Diana Fox Carney, Senior Advisor at Eurasia Group. Our programme today is part of the Global Stage series produced in partnership with Microsoft. And as the world gathers here in Scotland to address the planet's climate crisis, we're going to take a look at the progress, or lack thereof, we're making to curb carbon emissions and stop climate change. And we'll ask a provocative question. Given the state of global politics, is net zero really possible? To kick us off, I'm joined by my colleague, Eurasia Group Vice Chair, Gerald Butts, and Lucas Joppa, Chief Environmental Officer at Microsoft. Welcome both. We've already heard from many world leaders this week. So Jerry, what are the headlines for you so far?
Well, I think the commitments coming out of the G20 were unfortunately underwhelming. It's still pretty early to tell whether many significant commitments will be made over the course of the 2 weeks of COP. I'm encouraged by some of the smaller but important innovative announcements that have been made, for instance, from South Africa on getting off of coal. I think that India's statement that they've joined the Net Zero Club, however belatedly, is an important one. And there's some encouraging signs, but it's a little too early to tell.
Thanks, Jerry. Lucas, what stands out for you?
Well, for me, as Jerry kind of alluded to, there's some really difficult conversations going on, really, as the negotiators try to hammer out some of the details still outstanding from the original Paris Agreement. But what I can tell you from the private sector side is that there is an urgency to the conversation that's almost palpable in all of the meetings and across the venue as all of these organizations start looking from pledges to performance. Every conversation that I've been in has been about how are you doing, not what are your commitments, but how successful are you at working against them. And so that really, I think, is the big takeaway for me today is people are looking beyond pledges. They're starting to ask the hard questions about performance and then looking for those details about execution. How are you measuring carbon? How are you accounting for carbon? What are the systems that need to be put in place to actually make this whole net zero thing work? And so that's really motivational for me and for Microsoft.
I think that's fantastic to hear. We do need to see action and, as you say, move beyond pledges. So today we're going to examine the issue from three key angles. So first is the scope of the problem. Next is the politics surrounding and at times hindering action on climate and the environment. And then we're going to look at public and private partnerships as part of the solution. But first, before this live stream, we asked our audience on social media for their thoughts on some of the big questions we're tackling. One question we posed was, over the next 5 years, do you think climate risks will get better, grow worse, or remain the same? And here you'll see the results of our first audience poll. I think not surprisingly, only 9% said that it will get better, 76% said it will get worse, and 15% said it will stay the same. So we're going to start by examining that question, is the risk growing worse and why? And to talk with me today, we have Catherine Hayhoe, Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy. Catherine, welcome.
Thank you.
Catherine, a key goal of this conference is to accelerate action towards the goals put forth in the Paris Agreement adopted 6 years ago. In your view, how's it going?
It's going. And what I mean by that is before the Paris Agreement was signed, we were heading for a world that was potentially 4 degrees Celsius warmer than the one that we are used to, that our infrastructure was built for, that our agriculture was developed for, that our water systems were allocated for. Today, we have a 66% chance of a 2.7 degree warmer world. That's a lot better than where we were headed, but it's not enough yet. We need to keep warming below 2 degrees and at 1.5 degrees if we can to ensure that we don't see widespread dangerous impacts happening frequently, even concurrently, around the whole world.
Thank you. As you mentioned, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put a recent report out this summer on climate change, and they laid out some very stark facts on warming and the impact of greenhouse gases. Could you perhaps just explain a little bit the significance of the 1.5 degree goal and how far, well, you've already mentioned that we may 66% chance of getting to 2.7 degrees. But can you just talk a little bit about closing that gap, please?
Mm-hmm. So 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius are not magic thresholds where if we meet them, everything's fine. And if we go just a tiny bit over, everything's lost. It's like there's no magic number of cigarettes that we can smoke before we incur health risks. But we know that the more carbon we produce, the greater the risks. Now, for some people, climate change is already dangerous here and now today with 1.1 degrees of warming. People who live in the Arctic, where what used to be permanently frozen ground is crumbling and thawing under their feet and their homes. People who live in low-lying coastal areas who are being increasingly affected by king tides, sea level rise, stronger hurricanes and storms. People who were affected by the heat wave and the wildfires across Western North America this past summer, or in Greece, or the drought in Madagascar. Today, climate change is already loading the dice against us, and many are already suffering. But we know, in the words of the IPCC, that every bit of warming matters. Every action matters, and every choice matters. The faster we can cut our carbon emissions, the better off we will all be.
Thank you. That's a really important point. And it's, as you say, it's not a binary question. But we frequently hear things like by 2030 or by 2050, and obviously India pledged to get to net zero by 2070. How urgent is the need for change?
We need goals because that's the way we humans function. Again, the science says as much as possible, as soon as possible. But we need not just long-term goals, we need near-term goals. Why? Because it's all too easy for us as humans, individually, as well as countries, to say, oh, we'll do this in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. And then we spend years procrastinating on our way until it's too late. We need near-term goals and we need long-term goals to cut our emissions as much as we can, as soon as we can, to reach net zero as soon as we can, where the amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere equals the amount of carbon that we're taking out. And in order to accomplish those goals, we need everything on the table. We need efficiency. We need clean energy. We need nature-based solutions that invest in smart agriculture, soils, ecosystems, restoration, conservation. We need all the options on the table because what's at risk again here is not the planet. The planet will be continuing to orbit the sun long after we're gone. What is at risk here is us. Our human systems are among the most vulnerable to climate change, along with some of the plants and animals and other living things that share this planet with us. So the question is not, could we possibly spend too much trying to fix climate change? No. The question is, what's it worth to save everything we have?
Thank you for the clarity with which you pose the challenge that we're facing. One of the interesting things is how little we talk about this. And recently in an interview, you suggested that although 70% of people say they're worried about climate change, only about 14% of us talk about it regularly. Given this obvious concern, why do you think that is the case? And how do we begin to start those conversations?
The vast majority of us are worried about climate change. I live in the United States where 70% of people are worried. In my home country of Canada, in the UK, it's more. By the time you get over to France, it's about 84%. When you talk to young people or mothers, they are even more concerned about climate change. We're worried, but polls show that most of us feel helpless and we don't know where to start when it comes to climate action. We're told it's this problem that will overwhelm civilization as we know it. And then we feel like, well, what can I do individually? Change a light bulb, eat less meat? Now, don't get me wrong. Those things are definitely important things to do. But how do we change the world? We change the world by using our voices, and every single one of us has one, including the young people who are using theirs so effectively at COP today. Every one of us has that voice we can use to advocate for change wherever we work, wherever we live, in the places we love, the organizations we're part of, to talk about why it matters and to talk about what we can do together to fix it, how each of us can add our hand to that giant boulder that is already rolling down the hill in the right direction, and it already has millions of hands on it, but it is not going fast enough, and it needs every single one of our hands on it to get it going faster.
And is it that gives you hope? As someone who studies this day in, day out, it's that provides you hope, I understand.
Hope doesn't come to find us. We have to go find it. And we find our hope in action. We find our hope in recognizing that the science says our future is in our hands. This is a moment that will be written about in the history books, and it's up to us whether there will be history books. Now is the time to act, and our choices will make all the difference in the world.
Catherine Hayhoe, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you for having me.
Understanding the real and lasting impact of climate change and having the political will to take the changes, make the changes that are required are two very different things. So we're now going to turn to that issue of politics, activism, and the distance in between. I'm going to bring back Gerald Butts, and I'd also like to welcome from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Janine Mabundo-Lioko, who's a member of parliament, and she's joining us today from Kinshasa. So thank you so much for being with us, both of you. And Janine, let me start with you. Millions of Africans say that climate change has already disrupted their lives. They are at the front, the leading edge of this damage. And while Africa bears the least responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions, 7 out of 10, in fact, of the most endangered countries are in Africa. So from your perspective, what is the pathway forward that both allows for economic expansion and protects African populations from the climate crisis?
Well, thank you. And I'm very happy to join you and to be able to express the voice of, if not Africa, but a sizable portion of Africa, because we live in the Basin of Congo area. So thank you for giving us this voice today. And you're right. I think that it's very important to stress that the cost of inaction today is far more dangerous than initiating something. And from the lens of Africa, this has to be done in a fair way. In a fair way, because basically we have the sense and the perception that Africa holds the key of this climate crisis conversation, but we have to table that in a global context. The global context is that today the climate crisis is also a conversation about geopolitical resource battle where we need to scale up the production of electric vehicle and renewable energy, and that requires significant increase in manufacturing capacity and raw material inputs. But those raw material known as energetic material these days are being mined in places like DRC by people without basic access to electricity. And this is a paradox. This global imbalance must be addressed too in the conversation to make it heard and to make it endorsed by the African stakeholders. The world, for example, most undervalued resource is carbon processing forest. We have 1.2 million of absorbing CO capacity through our forest, because the Basin of Congo forest is basically the second biggest forest in the world after Amazon, and it has a stabilizing effect on this climate crisis fight, but it's unnoticed and it's not compensated in a manner which may be satisfactory for the African countries. So this is the way we see it, and this is the way we would like to change and transform the conversation.
Thank you. The Congo is completely at the center of this transition, as you've described, for trees and for the raw materials. And many of the activists here in Glasgow are talking about climate justice. What do they mean by that? And is it the same thing as the just transition, which is another phraseology we hear?
Is it to me to answer?
Yes, sorry, I'm continuing with you, yes.
I think in terms of climate justice, I think there is 180 plus countries which are in Glasgow and from different regions, and it's very true that facts and figures speak by itself. Facts and figures speak by itself because basically the most polluting countries are not in Africa, and we all take commitment, but the commitment have to be proportionate to our play, to our role in this agenda of climate crisis. And I will give you some figures. I will give you some figures to give you an idea on how it has to be about climate justice. China, European Union, US, and India emit over 40% of total global green gases, while all of Africa emits 7%. So coal, for example, which is a polluting energy sources, still accounts for up to 38% of electricity generation worldwide, which China, US, India, and the European Union being the biggest actors in using coal sources for their industrialization. And all of a sudden, it says, because it's the worldwide and global fight and commitment, that we need to abandon, we need to give up these sources of electricity. But it's a little bit unfair because meanwhile, this country have the time to develop themselves at a huge pace, and it's asked to African continent or African region to stop developing or to stop developing by using these polluting sources of energy. And that creates a problem of justice because on the other hand, you have 6 million of African who lack access to electric power. It can rise even further. Every year, we have 12 million of new people, young people, entering in workforce. And how do you give jobs? How do you create jobs for these young people who represent 12 million each year if you are not able to fuel your economy with fast and pushing energy? It's going to be difficult to develop Africa and our economy just with renewable energy limited to solar or wind. And that's where we speak about climate justice. Because on the other end, without the Congo Basin and the Amazon, the world will be warming much more quickly. So we contribute with our forests, we contribute with our mineral, energetic mineral raw materials, but it has to be noticed, it has to be valued, and our efforts have to be integrated in that general context.
Thank you so much. And the issue of energy access is clearly absolutely critical as we move forward. So thank you for raising that. I want to move to Jerry now. Jerry, in wealthy nations like the US, climate and environmental laws can be a political football with jobs, taxes, spending, all part of the equation. How has climate action evolved as a political issue in your experience?
Well, I think it's gone from, and this is part of the hopeful comment that Catherine Hayhoe was making earlier, it's gone from being a relatively fringe niche issue into one that's firmly within the mainstream of politics. And it's very difficult to imagine a political party getting elected in a country like Canada or even more recently the United States without a robust climate policy. I want to go back to something Janine said, which is, you asked a question, what's the difference between climate justice writ large and a just transition? The climate justice issue, look, the simple way to look at it is there are about 1 trillion tons of carbon in the atmosphere that shouldn't be there. And countries like ours here in Canada and the United States and the UK are almost wholly responsible for putting all of that carbon in the atmosphere. Countries like the DRC played little to no role, except insofar as their supply chains were commandeered to serve that purpose for the West. So when you hear poorer countries making the argument that it's the responsibility of wealthier nations to clean up the mess we've made, there's a lot of truth to that statement on the basic math. The just transition argument, which is a little different, is taking people who've worked in carbon-intensive industries whose futures are being compromised by the low carbon economic transition, and giving them a future that they can look forward to for both themselves, their communities, and their kids. And they're both really essential pieces of the puzzle. And it points to how large the scope of the transition we're enduring right now is, and how difficult it's going to be. I think it's important for us as analysts to be really direct with people that this is not going to be smooth. I think the direction of travel has been set very clearly. That when I get when I lose a little hope about the transition, I think about how far we've come and how short a period of time. And Catherine Hayhoe mentioned this, that we were headed toward a much worse place before the Paris Agreement, but we've still got a lot of work to do to get to a safe climate that we can hand to our kids. I think it's important to acknowledge that we have come a long way, but it's also important to acknowledge that the transition is probably going to get bumpier from here.
Indeed, we have to hold these two ideas in our hands at the same time. So let's take a look at another viewer poll that we conducted. We asked the viewers this time, how long until climate change disrupts your life? The choices were, it's happening already, 5 years, 10 plus years, or never. And these are the results. So 67% of you said that it's already disrupting your lives. 9% said 5 years, 12% 10 years or more, and 12% said never, and I'm interested to know where they came from geographically. But Jerry, we've already seen this year, particularly in Canada, the west of the US and Canada, devastating examples of climate change, and elsewhere in the globe, of course, too. What do you think it will take to turn that real public experience of climate change into political action of the highest urgency around this issue?
Well, look, as you and I have talked many times, Diana, I think that people change politics. Politics doesn't necessarily change people. And what people are experiencing on the ground right now with climate change is an undeniable manifestation of its consequences. So I think you've seen the debate migrate in the West from, is this happening and who's responsible for it, to a much more productive one. That is, what are we going to do about it? That's not to say the solutions are simple or lack complexity in any way, shape, or form. But I think the debate, when you take a kind of macro view of things, the debate has moved onto a much more productive ground. The example I always use is, had you told me even as recently as 5 years ago that the successful candidate for president of the United States would stand on a debate stage in October of an election year and say that his explicit economic policy for the United States was to move it beyond the fossil fuel era, I would have said you were watching an episode of West Wing and not something that was happening in real life. Yet it did happen. It happened in Pennsylvania. Joe Biden was elected president. There are enormous inertial forces within the U.S. political system that will mitigate against progress on climate change. But I think when you take the very long view, the direction of travel is set in.
And Janine, just coming back to you on that same issue, climate's an entire globe issue. How do we get action at that kind of scale?
I think that, like you said, it's the hope of everybody is that this COP26 is really the time for action, because there have been more than 6 years now that people are waiting for the commitment take a few years ago, and they want to see that it becomes concrete. We are all aware that countries may have different policies, different interests, but there is a sense of urgency now, and I think we have to move on. We have to move on in being very concrete, and we probably will do better in having some tangible goals, which is also understandable by the people who are living in the other side of the world and who may consider that this climate crisis conversation seems a luxury in brackets because we didn't probably explain it very well to them. I was just last week in the rainforest of Congo because it's my constituency. And it's very difficult to explain to a villager that you have to stop to cut the trees because there is the issue of the climate crisis, because you will say, and how do I live? How do I make a living? Because for me, it's a question of survival. And also, this is things which have been decided somewhere in Glasgow. And maybe he doesn't know where is Glasgow, and not to mention New York or Washington. So I think it's very important to come out with concrete and reachable goals. I think one of the most reachable goal that the African countries will probably plead on or advocate will be the delivery of the 100 billion commitment made a few years ago, and 100 billion commitment to mitigate the climate crisis in favor of the African continent. It's not big, because if you put in perspective with other figures, all the world were able to disburse 16,000 billion for the adjustment to the COVID-19. So I think as a world we can reach that goal, and we can pave the way of something concrete. Then two, I think it's not just a question of money, because money is not the rule of the game. It's a question, I would say, of a Green Deal. When people are cutting trees and burning sticks of wood, it's probably because they want access to energy. So how can we find credible subsidies and multiply or amplify renewable energy projects which can be transformational in this area of the world? Then three, I would like to remember that, to invite us to remember that COP27 will be in Africa. So we need to be very credible this time. Otherwise, they will not understand why should we keep on talking. And COP26 will be a cornerstone, and that's very, very important to know that if we are just on talk show, then it will make it less credible to go for COP27 without any real achievement at stake for all of us, not only for Western world or for Africa, but for all of us. And I think also that one of the shyness of some countries, which are not superpower, is that the global conversation should be a worldwide conversation, a worldwide effort and contribution, and not a new battleground for a fight between the United States and China on the ground of some other countries. And that is a worldwide conversation.
Janine, thank you very much for those comments. Thanks for joining us today. I'm now going to move on to our final conversation, which focuses on solutions and the role of organizations beyond government, such as NGOs, research institutes, and the private sector. So I have with me again, Lucas. Thank you for coming back. And we're also joined by my friends now, Koichi, who's director of the Center for Global Commons and executive vice president of the University of Tokyo. And Catherine McKenna, who's former Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, as well as of Infrastructure and Communities in Canada. So welcome to everyone. Now, Ko, I would like to start with you. Can you tell us how the problems of climate are viewed in your own country, in Japan, and across Asia more generally?
The climate issue in Japan is not really have a deep roots yet to the society. Somewhere in this community, there is a sense that carbon neutral is a
I think we're having we're having a little bit of technical trouble now because at the meeting. So I think we'll just move on for now and just ask Lucas, perhaps you could come in now and just describe the role that you think that the private sector will be playing in moving us towards net zero.
Well, the role that the private sector has to play in getting the world to net zero is absolutely critical, because it's the private sector that's going to build the solutions that the world needs to decarbonize our global economy, the carbon reduction, the carbon removal solutions, and then all of the other cross-economic work that needs to happen, that's going to come out of the private sector. And so a lot of focus to date has been spent on these voluntary commitments that the private sector companies have been making and need to make. And Microsoft is no different. We've committed to being a carbon negative company by 2030. But really, the real impact, besides meeting those commitments that the private sector can make, is developing the solutions that is going to get us to net zero. It's as simple as that.
And we hear a lot about, in addition to that, we hear a lot about technology and controversies about the role of technology in getting us to net zero. What do you feel about that?
Well, I'm pretty bullish on the role of technology to help the world to get to net zero. That shouldn't come as a surprise from a guy at Microsoft. But I do think it's really important, particularly on the foundations that we need to build that will support a net zero economy, particularly the carbon measurement, monitoring, and accounting solutions. That is where I think technology has a near-term, now-term opportunity to really help move the needle on the carbon issue. At Microsoft, we believe that just like every company now really has a financial system of record that sits at the core of the institution, there needs to be also a sustainability system of record that sits side by side as a second pillar of any corporation. We've released something called the Microsoft Cloud for Sustainability that lets companies do that, and there's many other solutions out in the market as well. But it's really important that technology, which now is how companies run, is also how companies run their execution against their sustainability commitments.
Yeah, it's all to play for in that space. So, and it's great to have companies like Microsoft pioneering that work. So, Catherine, I'm going to bring you in now. And I'd like, you've worked in government, you've worked in not-for-profit sector, you've done a variety of things. How do you see the scope for alliances and people working together in this space to find solutions?
Well, it's absolutely critical. I think we'll see whether governments all step up here at this COP. But the reality is they probably won't. All of them. We'll see new targets and some ambition. But if we're going to get to 1.5 degrees, it's all hands on deck. And I was looking at a couple of really great announcements here at this COP that don't always get the attention they deserve. So Ford Foundation just made an announcement with governments and institutions of $1.7 billion towards indigenous peoples and protecting forests. That's a big investment and, somewhat unusual suspects coming together. Another great one that really is close to my heart is actually the Michael Bloomberg's announcement yesterday to get 35 countries accelerate getting them off coal. He pledged up to $1 billion. Canada stepped up and pledged $1 billion. And that's the kind of partnerships we're going to need, because that will also bring in private sector. So there's a big discussion everywhere I'm going about blended finance and how, if we can have risk capital in there, if we can have governments, but also foundations putting up money that can then crowd in more private sector money that won't take the risk initially, then that's a huge opportunity. So I'm excited about seeing these partnerships. Of course, we need to see more. And ideally, we'd really see more ambition from some governments who still have yet to step up.
Thanks. It does feel exciting that the sums of money that are coming forward in all these spaces are really meaningful, and the opportunities for collaboration are great. I think we have Naoko back. Naoko, apologies. You were beginning to tell us a little bit about climate change in Japan.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Yes, thank you.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, it's a very vivid environment at the COP venue. It's very, very noisy. Sorry about it. The challenge in Japanese and the community, Japan for climate change, is that still there is a sense that the climate agenda, particularly the race to net zero, is something the Western agenda. So it's very difficult for me to say that. But the important thing is how Japanese society as a whole are convinced that it's an important agenda and to own it as the entire society. Well, it's true that there are maybe few difficult conditions, particularly for Japan, but also broadly in Asia. Number one, there is still a high reliance on coal. Number two, there is an industrial structure with much larger share of hard-to-abate sector. And for Asian countries, not for Japan, they are still at the development stage of the development. But with those difficult conditions, it's very important for us to really find a credible, concrete pathway towards the net zero. And I think that the real challenge for us is, number one, to wholeheartedly own that agenda, and number two, come up with a credible, concrete pathway, which we feel that it's our own pathway. Back to you.
Thank you. I think you echoed a point that other people have, which is this has to be owned by the whole of society. We are all implicated and we all have to be involved. And there's one way in which the issue is changing the private sector and the workforce, and that's the issue of the need for green skills. So earlier, GZERO Media spoke to Sue Duke, and Sue is Vice President and Head of Global Policy at LinkedIn. And let's hear some of what she had to say.
There is no question, but we are seeing the calls for us to get very real about our climate commitments getting louder and louder from governments, from companies, and from workers themselves. So on the demand side, we are seeing employers across the board making sweeping commitments about reducing their carbon footprint. If they're going to do that, they need to be able to hire new workers with new skills who can do those roles in a new, greener way. So if you take, for example, a company who needs to reduce its carbon footprint by greening its supply chain, they now need new procurement and logistical specialists who can audit and report on where they currently stand with the emissions of their supply chains, and also figure out and apply new strategies so that they can green those supply chains. On the demand side, as you said, we are seeing workers at all levels in all countries acquiring new green skills. And that's not just in those traditional green jobs, as we discussed, but in sectors that we haven't historically thought of as green. So if you take, for example, a fleet manager, it's probably not the first job you think of as green, but that is a great example of a job that has been around for a long time and is now undergoing this fundamental change because they're finding themselves on the front line of helping their organizations get carbon emissions out of their organization. They are now involved with managing a whole new fleet that will involve electric vehicles and all of the technological and logistical challenges that go along with that.
Lucas, whose responsibility should it be to train a workforce prepared for the reality of shifting skill requirements as companies try to do, as you say, and make good on these climate commitments?
Well, I think it's like everything else that we've been talking about. It's a shared responsibility. I think that our educational system has a key responsibility in making sure that sustainability is integrated and embedded in curricula from the bottom to the top. I will say that it's also the role of an organization, of a hiring organization, to ensure that the people that we're bringing in understand how sustainability is relevant and important to their job, to a program manager, to a software engineer, to a wind turbine technician, that all of the kind of the critical, obvious, and historical jobs of the past, those aren't going away. We need to embed sustainability in those as well as building new sustainability careers. And so I view it as a really critical partnership between the education institutions and the hiring institutions themselves to make sure that people don't just have the basic green skills, but they have the acknowledgement and the empowerment once they're in their careers to embed sustainability in everything that they do.
We keep on coming to this issue. This is a systemic transformation, and we need to change almost everything we do, whether it's skills or the way we consume or how we generate our power. So it's fascinating. But actually, the climate crisis isn't the only crisis. And I want to come back to Naoko now, because the Secretary General of the United Nations has talked about 3 crises running at the same time. And I know you're very focused on the global commons. And he's talked about the nature and biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and then a crisis of pollution. Perhaps you can tell us if you think we are making any progress in any other of the areas, or what the priorities are in these 3, to address these 3 crises together.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. I think it's a really important question. I'm glad that the Secretary General made that statement. To me, the big progress is that there is a underlining, there is a broad understanding of this fact that climate change and nature do have the same as the source. That it's basically the system collision between our economic system and the planetary Earth system. That's why we have a climate change, and that's why we have a biodiversity loss, and we have other pollution. So that once we do understand that scientific fact, it is much easier to come up with a solution. So the one big progress is that there is an increasing, growing understanding of this scientific fact. That's a number one. And that is why this nature agenda is actually the surfacing to this conversation, even here at COP. Carbon neutral plus nature positive, it's a big progress in terms of the going forward. But 2 more important things is that now the economic conversation, economic sector are trying to find out how to integrate this natural capital into the economic decision making. The conversation about TNFD, the science-based target for nature, all pointing to this need and desire to integrate the natural capital into the economic decision making. The last point is that the private-public partnership is the way to go, and we need a government to change the regulation, the policy, and then so that the private sector, including investors and the consumers, can really do their part. And I see at this scope there are quite a number of progress being made. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you. And thank you for again raising the issue of nature. I was in discussions this morning about resilience and adaptability, and nature really is the solution in that area. We rely on nature so heavily, and we need to preserve nature so that nature can help us preserve ourselves effectively. So that's a great point. I want to go to Catherine again now and talk about something which we hear a lot about, and that's greenwashing. So for all this hope, there is a concern that there's lots of false promises and inappropriate claims in the climate area. Perhaps you can tell us how worried you are about our agenda being derailed by greenwashing.
Well, that's a huge issue. I worry about that all the time, because now you're hard pressed to find a company that hasn't said that they're net zero by 2050. I actually can't even figure out right now how old I'm going to be at 28 by 2050. I mean, I could do the math, but that's the problem. It's so far away, and it's really easy to make these commitments. And that doesn't even mean that you have to know how to get there, but you better have a process in place. And that's why the work of someone that we all know, Mark Carney, is so important. Climate disclosure is really important. We need to actually understand baselines, and we need to understand, how you're going to translate your targets into real action. And then we need to track that progress. That's exactly what governments need to do, but it's also what businesses need to do. And, look, when you come to COPs, it's actually, I get very motivated and feel optimistic, and then I feel distinctly depressed. And that happens at different minutes of every day, because you do, hear lots of good words and nice words. But I remember talking to Patricia Espinosa, who runs the COP, and she said to me, like, with some of these new initiatives or new goals or new targets, like, what's the emission reductions? It's just math, as Gerald Butts has said many times. So it's great to have a new initiatives. It's great to sign up with new pledges, but actually what we need is gigaton reductions of emissions. And so we really need to be on that. We did talk a bit about technology. I want to say one thing that did give me hope. I think it's great that we now will have technology that will actually enforce transparency, including, for example, in the oil and gas sector. I think there's a lot of underreporting, which is also a real problem when it comes to things like methane. We will now be able to know exactly where by plants, where what the actual emissions are. So for me, goals are great. Emission reductions are the thing, and transparency is key.
Thank you. And I think you're referring to all our satellite capabilities around tracking gas emissions, which are really moving forward. Lucas, from your perspective, you already mentioned the importance of metrics and making sure that we are actually fulfilling our commitments. What do you think a lot about greenwashing at Microsoft?
Oh, we do. I mean, we think about it because we don't want that term to be associated with anything that we do. And we think about it because our commitments and our work is constantly being compared across sectors and across companies. And so I think what Catherine mentioned is just so important. Transparency and real reductions and real progress and constant transparent updates to the market, to shareholders, to investors, is just a key part of the process, because the who knows how old I'm going to be in 2050 problem is real. And what we know is that a lot of companies are taking this seriously and they're getting to work today. I know Microsoft is one of them, but I also know there's a lot of companies that have set those goals and have kind of set them and now have forgotten them and are thinking about coming back to them in 10 or 20 years. That is just not an option. I think that anybody that thinks that they set voluntary commitments in 2020 or 2021 and it's going to be voluntary for them to actually achieve them is just simply not being honest with themselves or with the market.
It's we're really nailing down on what needs to happen now, and that is fantastic. I was in a conversation with a bunch of journalists yesterday, and we were talking about ways to help people understand these 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases that have to be neutralized, eliminated, and also to help people understand the parts per million in our atmosphere. And so the sense that we need much more sort of public fluency with that kind of vocabulary and understanding of what needs to take place. I think it's a really important area. We did one final viewer poll, which I'm going to share with you now. GZERO asked our followers again, we asked who should actually pay for getting to net zero? Is it governments, polluters, consumers, all of the above? And here we have the results. So 9% put all the burden on governments, 28% said polluters. Of course, governments are also polluters. 4% said consumers, and 59%, the majority of you said that all of the above should pay. And I think that is basically where we're at. We all have to be part of this solution. So I'm going to just turn once more to Catherine and just ask, you've been in government, but you've also related to consumers in different ways. How do we get people more involved in this battle against climate change?
Well, it's really interesting looking at that poll because we separate different groups from polluters. We're all polluters. And the way, look, I'm just someone who believes that business or people will do the right thing if they have the right incentives. I happen to believe in the market. So the best thing would be a price on pollution because then you have the right incentive. And if people in Canada, we have a price on pollution, you get the money back. Where most people get more money back. So that creates, it doesn't unfairly punish folks. But I think that, just hoping that people will do the right thing is not a strategy. Certainly some people are very focused. Young people, I have to give them credit. They actually are, boycotting businesses. They don't want to actually work for businesses that don't care greatly about climate change. But it's always about incentives. And now, look, I think businesses are recognizing that it's about their bottom line. So they're providing different products. We're not just in the body shop era where the body shop was like the one place you could go who you knew cared about the environment. It's much broader than that. Some might be greenwashing. Many are probably real. But I think that government has a role to play in regulating. And this is why there's a big discussion here. Look, I'm on a number of panels about this. I don't know if it'll happen, but a global price on pollution or aligning different markets. Because if you actually embed the cost of polluting. It's the biggest market failure, as Nicholas Stern has said. I mean, how is it possible that you can go pollute and you can do it for free in many cases? That we need to build that in, and that'll create the right incentives. And so, I mean, but there's other things you can do. I mean, government, when it comes to plastics, you've seen government step up and regulate single-use plastics, putting bans on single-use plastics. And so, as I always say, I mean, it's all hands on deck. There's not going to be one linear solution. It's going to be messy, but we do need to think about behavioral changes and how do you incent people and businesses to do the right thing. And there are carrots and sticks, and certainly, I don't know, maybe you could call it a carrot and a stick. It's pricing.
Thank you. Nauka, when it comes to the nature space, how do we get consumers more involved?
Yeah, I think the information is clear. How to reveal the hidden cost of actually the what we eat or what we consume. If once the right information is given to consumers, I think it definitely encourages people to take the right decision. But just going back to what Catherine said, I think this moral-based or norm-based system is quite fragile. I think we need to really come up with not only incentive but also penalties, so that how to put the price on those externalities. Carbon is definitely one externality, so that's why the carbon price is important. But how to put the price on nature? I mean, how to value the nature? How to put the price of the natural capital, and how to incorporate them into the decision making? But at all level of economic decision is really critical. Once we come up with that, the system, then it will be much easier for each of us, that being a consumer, being the investor, and being the citizen, to move towards that direction. So that is, I think that something we need to go for to actually safeguard the global commons.
Thank you so much. So Catherine McKenna and Naoki Ishii, thank you so much for joining us today. I wish you luck in the rest of your COP journey, and let's make progress together. Before we go, I just wanted to give our co-hosts for this event, Gerald Butts and Lucas Joppa, a chance to offer some thoughts about what you've heard today. So let's start with Jerry.
Thanks. I think it was a remarkable covering of a very broad waterfront. If people come away from this discussion with nothing else, I hope it's with a deepened understanding of the complexity of these issues, some hopefulness that we're headed in the right direction, and a sense of empowerment that everybody, no matter where you are, has a role to play in making sure that the transition is a just one, both between countries and within them.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Lucas?
Well, I think I would just come back to how we kicked this off. I think what we heard was that there is this increasing urgency around moving from asking people what they plan to do, which is important, but also now really getting into what are you doing right now, demanding that near-term action, demanding that crystal clear clarity to the markets, and really thinking through the fact that there are solutions that every kind of economic actor, whether that's the private sector, the public sector, or what have you, can play. I think we heard from Catherine the idea of a price on carbon is one that's been around for so long, but its time is far overdue. The need for technology to support every organization and institution to track and record and report progress against their goals is just going to be absolutely critical. And there's already solutions out there right now. And that, this is just absolutely a topic that every single sector, every single organization needs to get involved in. It's a obvious place where the word partnership comes first and foremost across sectors and across economic activities.
Thank you so much. I mean, the enormity of this challenge is really true, but as someone who's been working in this space for a while, we are making progress. There's lots of more we can do, and I'm really grateful to both you and Jerry for being here today, for sharing your thoughts, and to, of course, all the audience who've tuned in, and I hope you feel better informed on these issues. GZERO will be bringing you live programming throughout the year on some of the world's most important political and diplomatic gatherings. You can also watch all our previous programs, learn more about our upcoming events at gzeromedia.com/global stage. I'm Diana Fox Carney, and from all of us, I'd like to thank you for watching. Have a great day.